The history of prisoners of war is as old as the history of warfare itself. In primitive times, captured enemies were forced into slavery. During the Middle Ages, when the concept of ransom was developed, it became beneficial to capture enemy fighters, especially if they were rich. As time progressed and war became strictly between states, a modern world opted for a more humane treatment of prisoners of war, considering them as enemies only when armed, and if captured, they could only be kept as long as the war was going. After the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was concerned with how they treated the prisoners, and so he set out to make a uniform set of rules which were used as guidelines on how to treat the POWs. The Geneva Convention was drafted in 1864. It made international rules of war and universal standards for the treatment of prisoners. Later iterations of like the new draft, written in 1929, wrote that prisoners must be treated humanely, and that the captive nations must supply information about any prisoners held, and they must permit visits to prison camps by representatives of neutral states. Of the 46 nations attending the convention, these provisions were only signed by 33 nations. The 1949 Geneva Convention, that was signed by 57 nations, greatly expanded and detailed the rules of conduct for the protection of prisoners throughout their captivity. The convention wrote that humane and decent treatment of prisoners is to be a right and is not subject to the whim of the captor. Prisoners of war are to be clearly recognized as victims of events and not criminals. Conditions confronting the treatment accorded to prisoners of war are affected by such factors as climate and geography, a nation's concept of armed forces, its acceptance and rejection of international conventions on the rights of human beings, and something as simple as the whim of the individual it captures. This has led some states to not follow the rules. For example, during World War II, when Russia and Japan considered those that surrendered to be totally disgraced, they treated their prisoners with the utmost contempt. In recent years, the United States has been a huge offender in committing war crimes, especially when it comes to prisoners of war. During the early stages of the Iraq War, members of the United States Army and the CIA committed a series of human rights violations and war crimes against detainees, including physical and sexual abuse, torture, rape, and even killing a prisoner of war. The abuses came to public attention with the publication of photographs of the abuse by CBS News in April 2004. The incidents shocked and outraged people. Documents popularly known as the torture memos came to light a few years later. These documents, prepared in the months leading up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, authorized certain quote-unquote enhanced interrogation techniques, which usually involve torture. Another example of the U.S. violating the human rights of prisoners is what happened in Guantanamo Bay, where prisoners were beat, waterboarded, and deprived of food and sleep. The Russian invasion of Ukraine started on February 24, 2022. Attacks by Russian forces were reported in major cities across Ukraine, including the capital. Western officials claim that by the scope, the war could be the largest in Europe since 1945. Finally, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights verified that over 6.6 thousand deaths of civilians in Ukraine have taken place during the war, as of November 2022. The UN Human Rights Office, or the OHCHR, says that both Russia and Ukraine have tortured prisoners of war. Their torture methods included beating, electric shocks, and humiliating treatment such as forced nudity during the conflict that has started with Moscow's unprovoked invasion of his neighbor in late February. The Ukraine-based monitoring team's findings were based off of interviews with more than 100 prisoners of war on each side of the war. The media conducted interviews to compare the scale of the abuses by both sides. Matilda Bogner, the head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring the War, said that the mistreatment of Ukrainian prisoners by Russians was fairly systematic, whereas she said it was not systematic for Ukraine to mistreat Russian soldiers. Most of the abuses by Ukrainian people against Russian prisoners of war were limited to 3 internment facilities, Bogner said, and were more common during the initial phase of capture. She said the vast majority of the Ukrainian prisoners interviewed reported torture and ill treatment, giving examples of dog attacks, mock executions, electric shocks, and sexual violence. Bogner also said that one Russian POW told investigators that on the way from the evacuation point to the transit camp, the car stopped at 7 or 8 checkpoints, and at each one, the Ukrainian servicemen accompanying us offered the military at the checkpoint a chance to beat us. Some agreed and some punched us. Ukraine and Russia both deny any accusations of harm. In summary, prisoners of war have been abused throughout history despite efforts to protect them. In the case of the Russian and Ukrainian war, it appears that the abuse continues and is an ongoing problem despite efforts from neutral organizations to stop them.